24 серпня.
On August 24, we say Happy Independence Day, Ukraine. During the 6 months, we change history, change the world, and change ourselves.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking proudly on his nation's Independence Day as the conflict with Russia reaches a grim milestone. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this, of course, is The Heat. Hello again. August 24th was supposed to be a joyous occasion for Ukrainians, a celebration of 31 years of independence from the former Soviet Union. But of course, it's being overshadowed by the 6th-month anniversary of Russia's military operation. This year's festivities were muted as Ukraine reels from a conflict that has killed thousands, displaced millions, with parts of the country in ruins. Many cities remained under curfew as fighting continues in the eastern part of the country and the south. We begin with this report from CGTN's Stephanie Free.
This is the sound residents of multiple cities throughout Ukraine woke up to on Independence Day morning. In central Kyiv, this was the sight on display. Ukraine's 31st year of independence from former Soviet rule was largely observed in solemn reflection. Independence Day this year also marks 6 months since Russia initiated its military campaign in Ukraine. As fighting continues, the country is on high alert for Independence Day Russian missile strikes. Ukraine's president is defiant.
We finally became united, a new nation born on February 24th at 4 a.m. Not born, but reborn. A nation that did not cry, scream, or panic. One that did not flee, did not give up, and did not forget.
Major Russian advances in Ukraine have stalled in recent weeks. Intel analysts predict Ukraine is gearing up for a next phase offensive. According to international NGO figures, tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and soldiers have been killed since Russia's February 24th campaign began. In Kyiv, President Zelensky paid tribute to those who have lost their lives defending Ukraine throughout the years.
I hope it will end during the current year so we can be joyful next spring and not lose more time.
Many Ukrainians opted to stay home this holiday. Others ventured out intentionally to display their national pride. Stephanie Fried, CGTN, Odessa, Ukraine.
Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from London is Marcus Papadopoulos. He is a historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia and the former Soviet Union. From Brussels, we have Peter Klepp. He is the editor-in-chief of Brussels Report. And here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin. He is, of course, a professor of history at American University. And also in Kyiv is Pavlo Kukhta. He's the former Ukrainian acting minister of the economy. Welcome to you all for the show. Pavlo, obviously, we want to start with you, being the day it is, and also where you are. Stephanie alluded to a lot of how Ukrainians seem to be feeling at the moment. Does that resonate with you? And where do you feel personally everything is going 6 months from this incursion by Russia?
Thank you for having me, Nathan. Well, today actually I drove from Lviv to Kyiv, so I kind of traveled throughout the whole western part of the country. And this was a day of air raid sirens in Ukraine. Yeah. So for most of the time, the gas stations, for example, were closed because there was constant air raids, more than 10 today in almost all regions. There were Russian cruise missile strikes throughout the country, mostly on civilian targets, some of them quite weird, like a rural road in Poltava region, but others quite deadly, like a train station in Dnipro region, where I believe a couple of dozen people have been killed. Otherwise, generally, the cities were a bit empty. So when I came to Kyiv, it's emptier today than usual because many people seeing the news and expecting some kind of actions from Russia that would be aimed at terrorizing the population, many people have left to be outside of the cities, particularly the capital. I know in some people who were buying iodine solutions, right? The drugs that you can take in case there is a radiation leak because of the situation in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So in general, there was an expectation that on this date, which is quite symbolic, Russia would try to do something, and this something would be aimed at terrorizing the civilian population, which is essentially what happened with the missile strikes.
Explain to us about that, because details seem pretty cloudy, but what's your impression?
In general, they seem to have lobbed missiles around the country, generally at non-military targets. So again, a train station hit at Dnipro, nothing military there. A rural road in Poltava, just plain weird. They wasted a multi-million-dollar cruise missile on an empty place. But in general, this seems to have been, it's much more active. Usually there's not that many air raid sirens throughout the day in Ukraine. This is very untypical. So they were trying to show that they are not leaving Ukraine alone, that they will keep pressuring the country. That's at least my reading of what the Russians are doing.
You said a day of silence, but also a day of defiance. And I'd like to get Marcus Papadopoulos' reaction to this off the bat, because we did hear a very defiant speech from Volodymyr Zelensky, who basically said, look, 6 months into this, we are not going to stop until everything is returned to Ukraine. Let's take a listen.
To us, Ukraine means the whole of Ukraine, all 25 regions, without any concessions or compromise. We don't know these words. They were destroyed by missiles on February 24th. Donbass is Ukraine, and we'll get it back, no matter how hard this path will be. Crimea is Ukraine, and we'll get it back, no matter how hard this path will be.
Marcus, what do you take of the defiant speech by Volodymyr Zelensky? And is he right? You see Ukraine doing that, or do you see Russia making these incremental advances that it has been making continue to stick?
Allow me to say, first of all, that in March of 1991, a referendum was held in the Soviet Union in which the Soviet people were asked, do they wish to preserve the Soviet Union?
Okay.
In the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, over 70% of the population voted to preserve the Soviet Union. The USSR was only dissolved by the actions of Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, and Stanislav Shushkevich, which was completely against the will of the Soviet people. Now, turning to the war...
Look, I think we know the history, and I do get your point here, because what you're essentially doing is drawing a question mark over the legitimacy of the state of Ukraine, correct? And why are you choosing to do that now?
Now, let me turn to the war in Ukraine. What Zelensky said today bears very little relation to the actual situation on the ground. The reality is that Russia has been winning the war from day one, from the 24th of February. The Russian High Command is one of the most revered and feared of all high commands in the world. Indeed, the Russian High Command's meticulous planning, which includes extensive contingency plans, is quite astounding. Accordingly, in the south of Ukraine, the Russian military campaign is going according to plan. And indeed, in recent days, the Russian army has made advances in the Nikolaev and Kherson oblasts, which is another demonstration that there will be no counteroffensive in the south by the Ukrainian army.
Okay.
Turning to the Donbass, the Russian campaign there is again, so far, going according to plan. Turning to the north of Ukraine, specifically in Kiev and Sumy, the situation needs to be explained. The Russian army was not defeated at the gates of Kiev. There was no battle for Kiev. The Russian army probed to see if the Ukrainian government would capitulate. When it became very obvious to the Russians that that would not happen, then the Russians implemented a contingency plan, which saw Russian forces relocate to the Donbass.
Okay, Marcus,
any military expert in the world will tell you that the ability of an army to adapt to a situation as quickly and effectively as the Russian army did makes the Russian army extremely...
Yeah, Marcus, okay, I get where you're going. I think everyone gets where they're going. Pavlo, do you just want to pick up on that? Because obviously he said a lot.
I would just be short. I mean, I will not go into some military discussion on the quality of the Russian armed forces, though I'm not of a very high opinion of that, having fought them actually on the battlefield. But otherwise, look, they were trying to march into Ukraine, flags raised, they expected no resistance. They suffered extremely heavy casualties on the Kyiv. After that, they retreated from the capital, suffering these heavy casualties. And since then, the front line is mostly stable. The advances that have happened in the east are extremely small if you look at the map. And in the south, where people who I fought with together are still there have been zero gains by Russia in the recent days. Zero. None. Okay. Nothing happened.
Well, okay, and I'll obviously let Marcus have a right reply to what you say later on as well. Let's bring in our other guest. Anton Fedyashin, we have had these competing narratives, haven't we? And you've been very good at analysing where the holes are. Where are the holes in these arguments?
Well, listen, it's not about holes. It's about what the map looks like. First of all, I have to disagree with Pavlo. The Russians have made gains in the south, and I get my information from the Ukrainian General Staff announcements, who were actually the first to declare just over the weekend that the Russians had taken a village called Blagodatne, and they're moving towards Mykolaiv. This is coming out of Kiev, not from Moscow. So the Russians are making very small, but they're making gains in the south. The only southern offensive, Kherson offensive, that we're seeing right now is, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, a Russian offensive, and they're slowly making gains in the east. Look, the problem here for the Ukrainians, unfortunately, is that the Russians have no calendar. They set no artificial dates. This is an open-ended conflict for them, and this is very much a war of attrition. And in terms of economic and military attrition, the Russians can withstand much, much more of it than the Ukrainians can. Zelensky's rhetoric is becoming increasingly defined. I understand him fully, but there are reasons for why he's doing it. Number one, the weapons supplies from the West are dwindling. Europe is no longer pouring weapons into Ukraine. And even the recent massive contribution, by the way, by the Biden.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Today's near $4 billion.
It has every right to, listen, it has every right to do so. The Americans have done this before. But look, this is the 18th tranche of money and weapons so far. That has maybe slowed down the Russians. It certainly hasn't turned things around. But I actually read Dr. Kahl, the Pentagon representative's statement today. It's very interesting when you look at the actual documents. These weapons now are not coming out of U.S. supplies. In other words, they can't be readily delivered. This is money coming out of a special fund. And according to the Pentagon itself, these weapons will be getting to Ukraine within a year, 2 or 3
years.
Yes,
because they're now going to the factories, not to the stockpiles.
They're actually ordering from the military-industrial complex, right? 3 years from now, this is not going to help Ukraine. Number two, because of how poorly things are going militarily for Ukraine, Zelensky is beginning to face domestic opposition. We don't talk about that much in the West because, for obvious reasons, there are other things that are, in front of people's eyes. But Zelensky has two very powerful challengers within Ukraine: the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, and then his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, both of whom have their own parties, both of which are fairly powerful political forces. And Zelensky, unfortunately for him and his career, has not been able to fully deliver. So, look, I think we should take his rhetoric also with a grain of salt and look at at the broader context here.
Well, let's talk about broader context. Let's hop over to Brussels. Peter Klepp, thanks for being so patient while we talk to all our other guests. You know, Emmanuel Macron came out today and talked about being with Ukraine in the long term. There seems to be a feeling in Europe that this is definitely going to go into the long term, with their eye on the winter, of course, Russian gas supplies. 6 months into this conflict, is the message of unity you hear from Paris and perhaps slightly less so from Berlin real, or are there fissures within the Union too as we go past this 6-month anniversary?
Well, I think there's two parts of this story. On the one hand, there's definitely unity. I mean, the West in general, but also European nations have been acting more or less in unison when it comes to this massive challenge.
Really, you don't see some more reluctant. You know, well, for example, the way I've read it is that the Eastern European countries, generally on the border with Russia or Ukraine, seem to be a lot more eager, and the ones further away, with the exception perhaps of London, a little bit more circumspect.
That's what, of course, what I was going to add. So there's two parts of this, but I would say that when push comes to shove, things are being decided more or less unanimously. It's true that, of course, the hawks in this conflict are the British and the Baltics and Poland, and the doves are clearly France and Germany that are, let's say, more in favor of trying to explore the diplomatic options, you know, to the maximum. That said, ultimately, when things have to be decided, things are being decided for better or for worse. There's been weapon deliveries, even financed by the European Union. There's been very far-going sanctions being imposed on Russia. And actually, the sanctions is where you would expect most of the divisions, where we have seen most of the divisions. The reason why they are limited to coal and partially to oil. Right. Is because of these divisions, but actually Russia has been quicker by basically interrupting the gas flows to Europe. So we didn't have to come to see it that far to have European divisions on whether to impose a gas embargo on Russia, because that's what Putin basically decided.
And a quick follow-up, you know, 6 months, you said the unity seems to be holding, but what about in 6 months' time? And what about the hopes of some sort of diplomatic push from Paris or elsewhere, considering we've seen a diplomatic push when it comes to grain and also, of course, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant from Ankara, from New York, the United Nations, and other countries wouldn't mind getting involved as well?
Well, indeed, very, very good point. It's very hopeful to see that on grain, a diplomatic solution of some sort, or progress at least, was achieved. And the analysis in European capitals is that the strategy of Putin is to sort of reduce the gas flows to Europe, which Putin then hopes would move public opinion in EU member states to push governments to sort of urge Ukraine to go to the table and sort something out with Putin. I mean, that's the analysis in Europe. To what extent that's actually the case, I don't think that's so clear. I mean, will European citizens and have they already been complaining about all of this? Yes.
Yes, very much
true.
So, yeah.
On the other hand, European countries are moving off Russian gas much more quickly than many people expected. So it's not so obvious as some have claimed.
With very high bills, though, and that's going to be very interesting to see. You're getting a lot of complaints, aren't you? Yeah. I'd like to go back to you, Pavlo, in Kiev. But before I talk to you, there was a UN Security Council meeting today. The Russia called, and they very much sort of pushing back on this whole idea that they are holding the nuclear plant hostage. Let's listen to the Moscow's ambassador to the UN on this.
At the last meeting, not a single Western delegation had the courage to condemn the shelling of the station by the Ukrainian armed forces and ask the regime to stop it. Nor was the courage found in European capitals. The capitals are simply launching appeals to Russia to stop the so-called recent activities surrounding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We're under the impression that our colleagues exist in their own parallel reality in which the Russian military are themselves shelling the station that they are protecting and are using the American systems for that.
Well, that's definitely Russian dry wit there for you. I'm sure you're used to it, Pavlo. But he does have a point that, okay, they may be in possession of the plant, but a lot of shelling's coming from Ukraine forces. What can we see the way through here? Because obviously this would be a disaster if there was some sort of radiation leak or worse.
Look, the solution is on the table and has been there for a number of weeks, right? It's a demilitarization of the nuclear power plant, and Ukraine is ready for that. And agreements have been reached to that end with the UN, with the head of the United Nations in Lviv last week. Again, it's totally up to the Russians. So, okay, they are putting up artillery, they are firing at Ukrainian positions and then complaining that somehow the station that they fully control and occupy is not demilitarized. Plain and simple.
They're using it as a shield, you're saying, essentially.
Exactly. You know, if they want to get rid of the risk of the catastrophe, it's very easy to demilitarize it. It's not a strategic town. It's actually situated behind a large lake. It's not even somewhere where, let's say, a Ukrainian assault would come or something of that sort. It's pure terror, nothing more.
No, it's very interesting. Marcus, I want to come back to you and change tack a little bit, because 6 months, part of the war over Ukraine, of course, has been the international sanctions. And we have seen a huge change in sort of perceptions of those over the last 6 months. First of all, we saw the ruble tumbling, interest rates going up. Every business, Western business listed on the Fortune 500 seemed to be departing. Of course, everyone did a story about McDonald's opening in the Soviet Union and then pulling out under Putin after Russian forces went into Ukraine. But then there seems to be this turnaround where Russia seems to be getting record receipts for energy because, of course, of the prices, but also weathering the storm domestically. How are they doing this?
Russia is the most sanctioned country in the history of economic warfare. Yet despite that, Russia is not just withstanding the West's economic crusade against its economy. Russia is actually prevailing. Indeed, in recent days, Reuters reported that since February of this year, when the Russian military campaign commenced, the Russian economy has secured over $300 billion worth of new contracts to export both gas and oil, which is quite astonishing.
And largely from Asia, right? We were talking about India, China, but also other Asian countries that haven't chosen, and African countries that haven't chosen to join the US and EU pressure for sanctions.
Indeed, and as you correctly said, sub-Saharan Africa and also North Africa.
And Latin America.
The reality of the West's economic war against Russia is that it has backfired. It has backfired so terribly that on the horizon for Europe, including Britain, looms a catastrophe in which millions upon millions upon millions of Europeans, including Britons, face the distinct possibility of falling into poverty, of becoming homeless. Now, Russia is not using energy, gas and oil as a weapon against the European people. No, Russia has responded to stringent, severe sanctions placed on it. What would any impartial party expect Russia to do? It's action, reaction. The reality is that Russia is actually winning this economic battle, and the West has actually shot itself in the foot. Okay. So much so that European governments this winter, at the end of this year and into 2023, face the real possibility of collapsing.
Okay. Anton, do you agree with what Marcus said?
Yes, I do, because on this economic front, things really look pretty bleak for Europe. Now, listen, I want to balance out what Mark correctly pointed out by also, of course, mentioning the Russian side. Depending on which industries you look, the Russian economy has, of course, been impacted by these sanctions. And Mark's absolutely right. They are unprecedented. Yeah. So if you look, for example, at the automobile industry, it has been hit very hard. But everyone is still receiving wages. There's been a collapse of production, but not a collapse of the industry.
Or consumption,
and I can guarantee you that the Russians are already looking at alternative markets for imports. And once they find them, which they definitely will, European companies, Western companies in general, are going to find it very difficult to come back into the Russian market on the earlier terms. They'll be coming back on Russian terms. The Ukrainians here are running, unfortunately, a really great risk. The grim realist in me tells me that the tragic conflict in Ukraine may become a sideshow because if the energy prices persist into the winter, which they are almost guaranteed to do, Europe is going to descend into such an economic tailspin that most people will simply not have the time or the resources to follow what's going on in Ukraine, let alone devote resources to it.
Sorry to cut you off, Anton, but I want to get Peter in again before we close. Anton has a point here that, we could see old people freezing in the winter. We have inflation running at something like 13% projected in the UK, higher elsewhere. Has Europe paid a bigger economic price for this war than the Russians? And of course, there is the the more developing world in the global south already getting punished by inflation, high oil prices and grain. So essentially, are the decisions coming out of Brussels backfiring both on the Europeans and the people they like to show that they lead the world?
Well, if you look at the history of sanctions, they have never been very successful to achieve the supposed goal.
Yes,
and this time around, even if it's a bit more different perhaps than in other cases, I mean, the success is not that obvious. If you compare it, for example, with the weapon deliveries to Ukraine, I mean, that's been a resounding success to help Ukraine at least. To what extent the sanctions have helped Ukraine or have undermined Putin, I think it's tough to make a case for that. Especially because then Putin has hit back and has actually, I think, also self-inflicted harm by destroying Russia's reputation as a reliable gas supplier that even dated back from Soviet times. So nobody's really winning from this. It's very difficult and tricky, I think, to make predictions. Nobody knows if Europe is going to fold completely or if much is going to change. I think a lot of depends actually on the battlefield.
Peter, I'm sorry, the clock has told us we have to go. I want to thank you in Brussels. I want to thank Marcus in London, of course, Anton here in Washington, D.C., and thanks again to Pavlo as well in Kiev. Always great to have you all on. That's it for this discussion. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. See you soon on another edition of The Heat.